Good evening and a very warm welcome to Ely Cathedral that is just about clinging on to the last of the summer warmth, although the autumnal chill is starting to creep in. So I see most of you still sitting with scarves and jackets on, which is probably wise. I'm delighted to welcome you to our lecture this evening, which is an annual lecture established in 2023 in memory of the Reverend Dr. Jenny Gage, who until her death the previous year had led Ely Cathedral's work on social and environmental action. Jenny was instrumental in advancing the sustainability commitments of the cathedral, including the A Rocha Eco Church Awards, where Ely Cathedral had gold and most recently had silver, and most recently has been awarded a gold Eco Church Award, which we are absolutely delighted about to be setting the example for other cathedrals around the country. One of Jenny's great gifts I have only been here 4.5 months and I've heard many good things, but one of her great gifts was at turning concern into action. So taking those things that we are so good at talking about and preaching about and making it happen. And this lecture honors her legacy by continuing to bring people together in thoughtful conversation about justice and sustainability. And of course, being in September, we found ourselves in the midst of the season of creation in the church world, where we remember about our call as disciples is not just to God and to neighbor, but for the whole of creation. Where we remember that God is the creator of heaven and earth, and that when we confess that, we are remembering that our love of God needs to translate into the way in which we live in this world. Where we remember too the fragility of human life and our dependence upon creation. And remember especially the way in which the climate crisis impacts those who are poor, those who live on the margins, those who are often forgotten about. That it is not just about life being good for us, but that Jesus came so that all people may have a flourishing life. And that we too can look at the world and remember that when God looked at the world after it had been created, God said, "It is good." And we continue to remember that in the way in which we live. But I'm also delighted to welcome tonight Dr. Hilary Marlow, who will be sharing with us her wisdom about eco-justice and faith, the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. Dr. Marlow is a biblical scholar, researcher, and writer on theology and the environment. She's an official fellow at Girton College, Cambridge, and a member of the Faculty of Divinity in the University of Cambridge. Hilary's ongoing academic research focuses on the Bible's depiction of the interaction between people and the natural world, and the relevance of this in contemporary contexts. She is particularly interested in religious, especially Christian motivations for environmental concern and the use of the Bible in environmental ethics. Hilary is the author of numerous publications and most recently has edited with Mark Harris the Oxford Handbook of the Bible and Ecology. She is also guest editor of a special edition of the Journal for New Testament Studies on the topic of creation and is currently working on a project examining the connection between wisdom and creation in books of the Apocrypha. Hilary regularly speaks on faith and the environment in churches and other non-academic contexts. For many years, she has been actively involved with the Christian conservation charity A Rocha, where she is currently a trustee. In her spare time, she enjoys tending a small field just outside Cambridge with her husband Ian, where they grow their own fruit and vegetables and try to be mindful of their own ecological footprint. We're absolutely delighted to have you with us this evening. Hilary is going to speak to us, and then there will be a time for questions afterwards. I'm not entirely sure if we can take questions from those who are joining us online, but certainly from those of you sitting in front of us. So I will hand over to Hilary. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Canon Jenny, for your introduction, and my thanks also go to the Dean, Mark Bonney, for the invitation to give this environment memorial lecture in honour of Jenny Gage, with whom I had the pleasure of working on several occasions. And it struck me this is especially hard when someone who's been so instrumental in pioneering environmental action in the cathedral is taken away from us. But it's really great that her legacy lives on, not least in the award of the Gold Eco-Church Award, which the cathedral now has. The cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. I don't expect you to know this, but you may. These words in my title come from Laudato Si, the encyclical of Pope Francis, in which he wrote of the challenges of global inequality and the impacts of environmental damage and depletion on the most vulnerable people on earth. Oops, need my clicker, bear with. I'll show you that one. Okay, thank you. He said, a true ecological approach always, and the italics are his, becomes a social approach. It must integrate questions of justice in debates on the environment so as to hear both the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. And it's precisely this call to listen to the cries of the earth and of the poor that will be our task for this evening. And just as Pope Francis addressed his concerns through the lens of his Christian faith, so too this evening we'll consider the implications of religious faith for our response to ecological crises and global injustice. I approach this from my own background and experience as a Christian biblical scholar and eco-theologian, but I'm convinced, as was Pope Francis, that these issues go beyond particular faith traditions. Indeed, they unite people of all faiths and none who are concerned about the state of the planet and our shared culpability and responsibility. First, I'd like to think a little bit about the scale and scope of the ecological problems facing the world. There are innumerable reports and statistics in the press on different issues, whether it's plastic pollution, changing weather patterns, rainforest loss, etc. It can sometimes be hard to see the wood for the trees. You just see an issue and another issue. But I've found that one helpful way of looking at the whole picture comes from the concept called planetary boundaries. What is this? Well, the idea was first suggested in 2009 by an environmental scientist called Johan Rockström, who worked at the Stockholm Resilience Centre in the University of Stockholm. And he and colleagues wanted to find, in their words, a safe operating space for humanity with respect to the functioning of the Earth system. And the planetary boundaries comprise 9 independent processes that are critical to Earth's stability and resilience, including things like freshwater use, ocean acidification, as well as climate change, biodiversity loss, and also, interestingly, something we don't think about, which is fertilizer, nitrates and phosphates as resources that are limited. Together, these boundaries set a framework to describe the limits of human impacts on the environment in relation to what the Earth system can sustain. Beyond these limits, suggests Rockström, the environment may not be able to continue to self-regulate, leading to instability and a high risk of abrupt or irreversible global environmental change with consequences for all living things. And this diagram comes from the third and most recent report in 2023. The scientists produced evidence that 6 of the 9 boundaries had been or were near to being breached. A really sobering situation. Only 3 are potentially within safe boundaries, and that's ozone depletion, aerosol loading, and ocean acidification. But even those are changing. So our current ecological situation can be seen as a consequence of how much and how many human societies have exceeded those boundaries by living in defiance of the delicate balance of the Earth system. It's as if we've ignored the deep connection between ourselves, other living beings, and the Earth. This year, 2 new books have been important to me, and both are relevant to this evening's lecture. Climate Injustice by climate researcher Friederike Otto, and the next one, Is a River Alive by Cambridge-based nature writer Robert Macfarlane. Let's think first about climate injustice. Breaching the planetary boundaries has huge implications for all of us, but it disproportionately affects those with fewer resources, especially in the global south. Research from the Stockholm Environment Institute, which as far as I know is not connected with the Resilience Centre, although they're both in Stockholm, of course, shows that 10% of the world's population, mainly in the UK, Western Europe and North America, contributes to over 50% of carbon emissions globally. The poorest 50%, mainly Africa and Asia, contributes only 7%. Other environmental factors besides carbon emissions disproportionately affect the poor. For example, the ability to escape or recover from extreme weather events, uncertain agriculture caused by increase in flood or drought, resulting in unsustainable land use, overfishing and depletion of fish stocks. The list goes on. The full title of Friederike Otto's book is Climate Injustice: Why We Need to Fight Global Inequality to Combat Climate Change. In it, she maintains that climate change is a symptom of inequality, not its cause. She cites the failure of political and social infrastructures and what she calls the extractionist mentality of the global north as drivers of climate change and other environmental problems that adversely affect many of the world's population. In the words of one reviewer, this book is about the weather and climate, but it's also about poverty, sexism, racism, arrogance, ignorance, and power. I'll leave you to read it for yourselves to decide whether you think she's right, but she certainly makes some really telling points. We're going to think about what religious faith might contribute to the conversation in a moment, but those of you who are familiar with the writings of the biblical prophets might already see resonances with their outspoken challenges to the social and political injustices and infrastructures of their day. My second book, Robert Macfarlane's Is a River Alive, vividly and lyrically tells the stories of his travels along the courses of 3 rivers in Ecuador, India, and Canada, and his delight in exploring their ecosystems, accompanied by different scientists, environmental lawyers, but also, interestingly, a sound recordist who recorded the sounds of the Ecuadorian rainforest, which apparently are quite amazing. Macfarlane describes in exquisite prose the beauty of rivers, but also their sickness, including the fate of the human communities that live with them due to climate change, pollution, and the power of companies, criminals, and governments. He asks really profound questions, such as whether nature has rights and whether a river could be a legal person. And he cites the example of the Te Awa Tupa Act in 2017, which gave legal personhood to the Wanganui River in New Zealand, Aotearoa. He says, to call a river alive is not to personify a river, but instead to further deepen and widen the category of life. And reading his accounts, you realize that the fate of these rivers is also a justice issue, not just for human beings, but for the rivers themselves and all that they support. And just as a quick aside, he tells in the introduction to the book how his young son, who was about 8 or 9, I think, asked what the title of this new book would be. And when he answered, Is a River Alive?, his son just said, well, it's going to be a very short book then, because of course the answer's yes. The wisdom of children. Is a River Alive reminds us that we are just one species among many on this planet, and that nature is not merely a backdrop to human activity. The post-Enlightenment scientific and religious agendas that sought to tame nature for our own benefit and to use the planet's resources to line our pockets are morally and spiritually bankrupt. We need to heed the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. This brings me to the question of faith, specifically, in my case, the Christian tradition, and what it might contribute to the conversation about eco-justice. My research over the last 20 years has shown me just how much the Christian scriptures, especially the Hebrew Bible, the Christian Old Testament, has to say about the issues we're discussing. And this is not only relevant to those for whom these are sacred scriptures. The recent rise of eco-criticism in literary studies has encouraged the study of the relationship between human beings and nature. And this includes critical analysis of what it means to be human. Moreover, studying ancient literary texts from an eco-critical perspective can and should contribute to cultural and social change. This evening, I'd like to highlight 5 important points. The first is the interconnection between all things. Now, ecology as a science looks at the interconnections of different species and their habitats and their resources. And from a Christian perspective, with a belief in God as creator of all things, these interconnections have a theocentric orientation. So I use what I call the ecological triangle, just as a lens, a means of reading biblical texts from an ecological perspective. And I'm not the only one to do so. Several eco-theologians have done this. From Genesis to Revelation, the land, the natural world, or in theological terms, the creation, is depicted in relationship with God and with human beings. This can be a very positive connection, as in the commitment made by God after the flood, not to destroy the earth again, in which the everlasting covenant he makes is not just with Noah and his family, but with every living thing on earth. Or we might think of some of the Psalms, like Psalm 104, where the psalmist celebrates the habitats and life cycles of numerous creatures, of which human beings are just one among many, before declaring, "In wisdom you have made them all, the earth is full of your creatures." However, often in the scriptures, this relationship is fractured and fraught, especially between human beings on the earth and the earth. Take, for example, the story of Cain and Abel in the early chapters of Genesis. When Cain murders his brother Abel, we're told that his brother's blood cries out from the ground, and that as a consequence, the land will no longer provide for Cain. Likewise, the prophet Isaiah speaks of the devastation of the earth on account of the actions of its human inhabitants. The earth lies polluted under its inhabitants. They've transgressed laws, violated statutes, broken the everlasting covenant. Notice the link back to the everlasting covenant in the story of the flood. We're going to return to this idea of the devastation of the earth in a moment. But those words sound very resonant of what we see in today's world. My second point concerns the strong ethic of justice and the indictment of flawed leaders and systems that is at the heart of the Christian tradition. Justice for the poor and marginalized is Justice for the poor and marginalized is a key requirement of the scriptures, both in the law and the prophets that Christianity shares with the Jewish tradition, and in Jesus' own words in the New Testament. Here are some examples from the book of Deuteronomy. Not having much success here. Execute justice for the orphan and the widow. God loves the strangers, providing them food and clothing. Don't gather the edge of your fields. Leave it for the stranger, the orphan, the widow. And abuses and injustices are heavily condemned. Cursed be anyone who deprives the alien, the orphan, and the widow of justice. Those are really strong words. And the familiar words for many of us from the book of Leviticus, you shall love your neighbor as yourself, that are reiterated by Jesus, and they form part of our own cultural heritage, even though perhaps many people don't know where they come from. But in today's global village, in which our carbon footprint adversely affects people on the other side of the world, I'd suggest that our neighbor is surely a Tanzanian subsistence farmer or a South Pacific islander whose land is being submerged by rising sea levels. We live in a global village, and so our neighbor is not just the person sitting or living next door to us. Let's go back and think a little bit more to the prophets of the Hebrew Bible. Now, these prophets were not just concerned with predicting the future far ahead. They were actually reading the signs of their own times. They were often outspoken critics of their societies. They were indicting their leaders for exploitative practices, for neglecting their basic duties of justice. Their words were uncomfortable, challenging. They provoked anger and persecution, and so they should for us today, provoke us. So, for example, let's go back to the prophet Isaiah. Cease to do evil, learn to do good, seek justice, rescue the oppressed, defend the orphan, plead for the widow. And in the context of land grab, forced land dispossession, which is still all too relevant today, Isaiah condemns the Jerusalem wealthy elite by saying, you who join house to house, who add field to field until there's room for no one but you, you're left alone in the midst of the land. The Lord of hosts hath sworn, many houses shall be desolate, large and beautiful houses without habitant. In other words, you grab, it will be taken away from you. Likewise, the words of the prophet Amos to wealthy merchants who cheat subsistence farmers. Hear this, you that trample on the needy and bring to ruin the poor of the land, buying the poor for silver and the needy for a pair of sandals and selling the sweepings of the wheat. These were merchants who were cheating the poor out of their right payment for the goods. And what about this from the prophet Micah? God says, can I tolerate wicked scales and a bag of dishonest weights? Your wealthy are full of violence, and your inhabitants speak lies. Again, a really robust condemnation for the evil doing, the injustice of that society. I'm not sure we're always that good at speaking out that clearly in our own against injustices, but there's a clear verdict if ever there was one. But it's not just the poor who suffer as a result of such abuses, which brings me to my third point, and that's the effect of human actions or inactions on the natural world. The biblical prophets, even though they weren't living in the kind of scenario of profound ecological damage to the earth that we now live in, yet they still drew attention to the suffering or the lamenting of the earth as a result of human evil. A number of prophetic texts use the concept of the land mourning to describe this effect on the earth. The connection between humans and the earth is one that causes the earth to lament. There's a really good example from the prophet Hosea, who chastises the Israelites, firstly for their lack of faithfulness and loyalty, their lack of knowledge of God. They've neglected God. And as a result, he says, swearing, lying, murder, stealing, and adultery break out. You might see echoes in the Ten Commandments there, of the Ten Commandments there. Bloodshed follows bloodshed as a result of this lack of attention to their God-given responsibilities, their societies fragment and break down. But then he says, therefore, because of this, the land mourns and all who live in it languish, together with the wild animals, the birds of the air, even the fish of the sea are perishing. For Hosea, the breakdown of human societies has a profound effect on the well-being of the land and its creatures. And there are numerous other connections in the prophets of the broken connection between God, people, and the land that sustains them. One more example is all we've got time for tonight, but that's from the prophet Jeremiah, who laments over the desolation of the land and then attributes it to the actions of the people and their neglect of God's laws. Take up wailing and weeping for the mountains, a lamentation for the pastures of the wilderness. Why is the land ruined and laid waste like a wilderness? The Lord says, because they've forsaken my law that I set before them and have not obeyed my voice. You know, these words of Hosea and Jeremiah were written over 2,500 years ago, and the context of their authors is very, very different from our own, and yet the resonances are so clear, so similar. And another biblical scholar, Carol Dempsey, puts it like this: the planet and all its inhabitants and life forms are suffering in large part because some members of the human community have violated their right relationship with creation, tipped the balance and acted unjustly and unethically. When read in a contemporary socio-ecological context, the texts of the prophets offer readers a disturbing picture that calls for an ethical response that can no longer be avoided. The message is clear. Our failure to live by the principles of justice and neighborliness results in the desolation of the land and causes untold suffering to human beings and other living creatures. I don't know about you, but hearing about the state of the world, whether it's ecologically or in terms of global politics, it can be pretty depressing and disheartening. It's no wonder that eco-anxiety is on the rise, especially amongst the younger generation. And I read a worrying statistic just this week in The Guardian that reported a survey showing that nearly 80% of children in the UK experienced eco-anxiety. And this highlights another, and this is my fourth point, another important contribution that faith can make to the conversation, and that is the possibility of hope. The Hebrew Bible authors spoke of the importance of shalom, that deep-rooted peace and well-being in the future as well as in the present. And they envisaged a world without war and injustice, a world in which nature flourished as well as human communities, as the prophet Isaiah depicts it. The wilderness and the dry land shall be glad, the desert shall rejoice and blossom. Like the crocus, it shall blossom abundantly and rejoice with joy and singing. For waters shall break forth in the wilderness and streams in the desert. And the New Testament writers also spoke of an ultimate future hope, the future hope of new creation, inaugurated by God, a renewed earth in which mourning and crying and pain will be no more, but the tree of life will flourish and blossom. Now, despite the attempts of Christians throughout the centuries to speculate and try and work out when this new era was going to come in, it's dependent entirely on God's transcendent acts and God's timing. It's beyond our wildest imaginings, and of course we will all have different ways of envisaging it. But alongside this kind of ultimate future hope that is to come, the New Testament writers were firmly rooted in the present, and they stressed the importance of what theologian Richard Bauckham calls proximate hope. Proximate hope is, he says, what we can desire and envisage that reflects within this world the ultimate hope of new creation. And so perhaps it's reflecting that we pray pretty well every week, if not more often, in the Lord's Prayer, your will be done, your kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven, something here and now in the present, something proximate, something here with us. And Jesus often reminded his followers that his very presence on earth was the inaugural sign of the kingdom of God that would ultimately result in that new creation. But he urged them to participate in bringing that kingdom to fruition. And in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus commands his disciples, go into all the world and proclaim the good news to the whole creation. The good news that Jesus inaugurated by his coming, his incarnation, his death, his resurrection, his ascension, is good news, not just for human beings, but for all creation. And we might like to reflect what exactly that means in the context of the Apostle Paul's words when he describes the whole creation groaning in labour pains as it waits for the children of God to take their place. Richard Bauckham puts it like this when he describes proximate hopes. He says, proximate hopes depend partly on what humans do. God's providence is constantly at work engaging with human evil, leaving its effects, bringing good out of it, but he does not abolish it in this world. Instead, I suggest, faith in God impels us towards action, to reduce poverty, to relieve suffering, to repair a world that we have damaged beyond recognition, to seek to reduce our ecological footprint, to bring about justice for the earth and for the poor. And the hope and perseverance to continue doing this, even when the news is so depressing, comes from our ultimate hope and faith in God and God's love and redemptive purposes for the whole world. Now, in the introduction, Canon Jenny mentioned that I'm a trustee of the environmental charity A Rocha, trustee of International A Rocha. A Rocha in the UK is behind the eco-church movement, as you may well know. I've just got time, I think, to just share a story of hope, because actually hope is about things happening in small ways, in different places, because individuals and communities take action. It's kind of not, if it's too big and broad, it becomes a bit nebulous, but it's about the doing in the here and now in a small way. And I just want to share with you one example, and this comes from Kenya. So the A Rocha Centre in Kenya is on the Indian Ocean, and it's right beside a piece of endemic forest. So I think it's dry forest actually, which has a number of endemic species that only exist there. And it was forest that used to stretch right up from the north, right down through Kenya and beyond. But now, thanks to deforestation, the forest is quite small. And the local villagers living pretty poorly, were in the habit of cutting down hardwood trees from the forest and selling the wood in order to be able to fund their secondary school education, which is not free in Kenya. Who can blame them? Because education is the route out of poverty, as we know. So they were doing what is justifiable, but has the effect of damaging the rainforest beyond repair. And A Rocha came up with the asset scheme, which is an eco-tourism scheme, whereby the wealthy hotels that line the Indian Ocean just in the vicinity would encourage their visitors, their guests, to contribute perhaps $5 during the course of their stay to go into this fund. And out of the fund, villagers could apply for bursaries for their children to be educated. And I think over 200 children have benefited from that since the scheme's been running. But the plus side, of course, is not only do the children get educated, but the people that have been cutting down the wood become advocates for the forest. They then become forest guides. They take the tourists in to show off this beautiful forest. And so they stop seeing it as a resource for their school fees, but actually as a resource that they can cherish and love and protect. And so that's a win-win. And those kind of stories are the ones where individuals and groups have been imaginative and thought about how can we deal with what seems an intractable problem. In that case, a clash between sort of environmental issues and social issues, poverty. And that is what came about. You know about eco-church. How then should we live? And in this final section, I'd just like to draw on some insights from the rich wisdom traditions of the Hebrew Bible. Wisdom in the Bible is often represented in female form, which cuts across the traditions of patriarchy and hierarchy that often characterize religious discourse. Woman wisdom is intimately associated with creation. For examples, in Proverbs 8, ages ago I, wisdom, was set up at the first, before the beginning of the earth. When God marked out the foundations of the earth, there I was beside him. My current academic research examines from an ecofeminist perspective the figure of wisdom in the books of Ben Sira and the Wisdom of Solomon, part of the Apocrypha in the Christian Bibles. And these texts also echo woman wisdom's importance to the created order. I came forth from the mouth of the Most High and covered the earth like a mist. Over waves of sea, over all earth, and over every people and nation, I have held sway. That is woman wisdom. And then from Wisdom of Solomon, with you is wisdom, she who knows your works and was present when you made the world. She understands what is pleasing in your sight and what is right according to your commandments. Wisdom's relationship to God and creation and her intimate involvement in the workings of the world invite us to take seriously her role in our present predicament, in knowing what is pleasing in God's sight and what is right according to God's commandments. And there's no doubt that we need wisdom to make just and ecologically sustainable decisions in our daily lives, as communities, as nations, as the global world. However, and hopefully not, if you're expecting me to give you a list of do's and don'ts for living lightly and justly on the earth, I'm afraid I'm going to disappoint you. There are choices, sometimes difficult choices, we all have to make about how to live, what we can afford to do, what we can't, how we offset one thing we'd like to do against another. Sometimes it can be hard to work out. We each have responsibilities to find out the facts, to weigh up the options, to steer our own courses, as well as join with others, encouraging one another, seeking solutions, working out what the best is. And I'm sure when this cathedral was working towards its different eco-justice awards, there were lots of debates as to how to do this, how to work out the heating system, what would be the most sustainable solutions. I know it didn't come easily. It took working at, and that's right. That's how it should be, because when you have intractable problems, you cannot just have a one solution fits all, wave a magic wand and it'll all be okay. We've got community responsibility as well to press for change, to educate others, to be those that are change makers. But I was struck by the fact that in one description of woman wisdom, in the Wisdom of Solomon, the sage lists 4 key virtues that come from wisdom's hand: self-control, prudence, justice, and courage. If anyone loves righteousness, wisdom's labors are virtues. She teaches self-control, discernment, justice, and courage. Nothing in life is more profitable for mortals than these. And it struck me that each of those has a profound relevance to the way that we behave in our 21st century context. Never has it been more so that we need self-control, we need discernment, we need justice, we need courage in order to be able to live. Our challenge, though, is to put these into practice, to work out what they mean for us, and to encourage others to do so. As I draw to a close now, I suggest that we need to be, in the words of Laudato Si, those who are learning to live wisely, to think deeply, and to love generously. Learning to live wisely, to think deeply, and to love generously. Or, as the prophet Micah put it over 2,500 years ago, he has told you, O mortal, what is good. What does the Lord require of you but to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with your God? And in case that seems hard sometimes, and it does, I'm going to leave you also with the commentary on that verse that is taken from the record of Jewish rabbinic debates, the Talmud, which says, "Do not be daunted by the enormity of the world's grief. Do justly now, love mercy now, walk humbly now. You are not obligated to complete the work, but neither are you free to abandon it." Thank you for listening. I'm very happy to take questions if there are any.
First of all, I'd like to thank Hilary very much for enlightening us in a very different approach to the last two lectures. It's put things in a very different but extremely interesting perspective. So thank you very much. Getting down to a more practical level, because those who know me, that is what I am all about. At the moment, we're seeing a big swing against the environment, against doing anything about climate change. We've seen statements today, the governments are all now realizing that the economic consequences are going to be bad for their electoral prospects. And of course, we've got the huge rise, particularly in America and in this country, of movements which are politically against it. How do you feel, when we meet people in the streets, we talk to people, how do you feel we should counter this?
I think that's a really great question, Robert, and I think that's one of the intractable problems we face. I think we need to, some of us will be campaigners, some of us will be lobbyists, some of us will be those who naturally get engaged in the political sphere, in whether it's at local level, council level, local MP. But I do think that if enough people speak up, then governments have to listen. I mean, I was encouraged to read that the Green Party membership has taken an uptick as a result of the fallout between Corbyn and Shabana. So maybe the Green Party is going to be a vehicle for really calling us to account. But I have to say this is one of the areas that I also despair. I mean, I frequently read the headlines and just go, oh my goodness. And back in 2008, when the Stern Review came out, which suggested that engaging in environmental sustainable solutions was better for the economy, it feels that's just all gone away. So I'm afraid I don't have a really clear answer. I'd be lovely to hear if anybody else has something to say that they think would really be a good solution. And all I can say is chip away at it, and make sure your MP knows what you think, make sure you think about how you vote, and make our voice heard. And also support the people you know that are campaigning. I've got a really good friend who works for a charity that does a lot of campaigning and gets a lot of flack on social media because of it, but letting people know that you're behind them as well as you're wanting them to carry on with their campaigning. I'm afraid that's a non-answer really, Robert. You were hoping I had a magic solution and I don't, but it's good to raise the issue though so that we're in no illusions. So
thank you. How do you understand, in the context of all that you said, the idea that humanity is the crown of all creation?
I don't subscribe to that view. I think it was Philo who first coined that phrase in the first century. I think that it's done a lot of damage, but when I look at, and some people interpret the story of creation in Genesis 1, where human beings are created, and God says, blesses them, as being kind of the pinnacle. But I don't. I read Genesis 1 alongside Genesis 2, which forms the first human out of dust, and along with all the animals that are formed out of dust. So I see us as one species among many. That's why I put the quote in from Psalm 104, which just highlights that. Biblical writers saw humans as one species. It's really interesting that the language of image of God, which humans are made in the image of God, which a lot of people will be familiar with, is nowhere near as frequent in the Old Testament as the language around us being frail, transient, we're dust, we're grass that fades here today and gone tomorrow. So I think there's been an imbalance and I think it's come about because of a sort of human desire to make sure we are the top of the pile, as it were, but I think it's done a lot of damage. I think we need a lot more humility to say, actually, okay, so we may have all sorts of attributes that other living things don't. The ability to do this, for example, language, technology, and so on. But actually, that doesn't make us better than other creatures. And it doesn't mean that in God's eyes, we're supreme. We are creatures. We are creatures, full stop. It's interesting, in a number of the Psalms, the prerogative that we assume is a human one to worship God is actually also ascribed to other living things and also to inanimate. Let everything that has breath praise the Lord, says Psalm 150. In Psalm 148, it talks about mountains praising God, trees, hills. So a lot of the things that we've assumed are our prerogative, I think, are a misunderstanding, certainly is the way that the biblical authors viewed it. We could go on a long time on that one. You touched on something I feel quite strongly about, but I'll leave it there for now.
Hello, Hilary, in another voice, as it were, from the old
Hi, Nigel.
Analysis and Environment Group. I'm Nigel Cooper. I'm going to be presenting a draft environment policy to Bishop's Council on Thursday.
Excellent.
In it, and I think I probably better own up most of this particular thing I'm going to say in my own words, so any Bishop's Council people present, you can shoot me down. But people often link the environment to the 5-mark submission and talk about the 5th mark, about the integrity of creation, as an obvious environment mark. And then they go on to talk about the way in which, particularly the 4th mark, about unjust structures, as you've been setting out, and the 3rd mark about caring for our neighbour, which is rather linked with that in the sense of the harm that environmental destruction will do. And we're quite focused on the 2nd mark, which is about nurturing believers, helping us, as it were, to take our environmental responsibility very seriously. But I don't think we've paid nearly enough attention to the 1st mark, which is proclaiming the gospel. And in our present circumstances that both you and Bob have alluded to, the gospel desperately needs proclamation. The environment and associated socio-economic forces that are around, that the Pope highlighted, are a profound sin. And we need to be proclaiming to our society that we are facing sin and judgment, and we need to wake up to that as a church. And then to go on to speak about the grace of God and the possibilities of hope. And this is something that we should be doing as Christians and as proclaimers of the gospel, and not just leave it to the Green Party or whomever. I do actually campaign with the Green Party, but more importantly, I proclaim with the church. So that's not so much a question, but you ask the question, what do other people think? And so I'm contributing that. But I would be interested to know you or perhaps other people's reaction to that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think you've made a really good point, and I think, calling out both individual and structural sin, or whatever you want to call it, is a really important part of fulfilling that calling. But what I found intriguing is seeing it from a slightly different perspective, is that in a time when the church attendance in the country is in decline, and particularly amongst younger people, that having a concern about the environment and for churches to show that they're concerned, that they're actually doing something, is a way of connecting, a way of people saying, oh, actually, maybe the church has got something that's relevant to today. The church isn't just out of date and stuck in the past. Maybe it's actually doing some good. And also, I found that it's a shared concern for the environment is a bridge builder with different communities and different community groups and across different faith groups. And I've spoken in Jewish synagogues and to Muslim young people, and there's this sort of wow moment of realizing actually we share the same, not just the same concerns about the environment, but actually they're based on the same foundations of theological foundations, and that is a really good way to build bridges, as well as, or a better way than, to start to bring about good interfaith dialogue instead of starting with the issues that we know we might disagree on. But yes, I do take your point. Thank you.
Your talk has been a marvellous conspectus of what the Bible tells us about what we're concerned about here, and what our nation should be concerned, our world should be concerned about. I can't help noticing that so much of it comes through the Old Testament, and just a comment, really, perhaps more than a question. Do you detect any particular lights on what you would Hebraic leaders and Jewish religious leaders? I'm afraid Israel press at the moment, so that nobody expects any good to come from them, but we should jolly well know the riches that have been given to us through the Bible and assimilated and passed on and amplified to us by Jesus. And I wondered if there's anything you should point us toward. I notice, of course, that there's something from the Talmud in front of us at the moment, and there may be something in that direction too, but the most obvious one is from what do Jewish people make about it? What do Jewish religious people make about it? I'm not talking about the Prime Minister or anybody like that. You'll be glad to know.
Well, yeah, there is a really strong environmental movement within Judaism, eco-Judaism, and there is a scheme called Eco-Synagogue that runs in this country, and there are several ways in which Jewish theology takes different parts of the scriptures that we share and makes their own narrative. So there's a concept in Judaism called Bal Tashit, which means do not destroy, and it comes from, I think it's Deuteronomy, where they're told not to destroy the fruit trees when they enter the land. It says, are the fruit trees human that you need to destroy them? You just leave them be. So that's one concept, very, very strong in Jewish environmental ethics. And there's another concept which I think is called Shemitah, which is taken from the principle of the rest for the land, the Sabbath rest for the land. And actually, I know that there are some communities within Israel and in the wider Jewish community that are trying to live like that, to farm sustainably in a way that gives rest to the land. And I would say that the Jewish eco movement is probably as strong, and particularly in the States where the Jewish population is much larger than as the sort of Christian ecological movement is. So yes, very much so within the religion of Judaism.
Just a comment really from the first question. I think also it's important to acknowledge that cheap is not always cheerful, and that actually trying to be ecological, it does cost money, and I know from our frequent visits to the plastic-free shop that it's much more expensive doing it that way, and it's much cheaper just to go to the supermarket, and to do what everybody else does. So I think it's just for us as Christians just to acknowledge that actually it is more expensive, to act responsibly concerning the environment.
I think that's right, and I think that's why, in a way, very careful not to say you should do this or do that, because everybody has different economic realities, and it's not. I don't think it's helpful or our business to kind of point the finger at other people for their choices. I think it's up to us to make sure we make the best possible choices within our economic means. But I also think that what has happened sort of nationally, and I mean, Pope Francis makes a big thing of the kind of economics of it, that we've got so caught up in the growth mentality that economic growth is going to get us out of everything, that it comes at a cost, and it comes at the cost often of doing things that are more sustainable. And that's really difficult, because that's the entire narrative on which capitalism is based, is that economic growth is what you're striving for. And nobody wants to see their wage packet get smaller. Everybody wants to have a higher standard of living, and that's unsustainable for the planet. It's really difficult. Thank you for raising it, though.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for the talk, and thank you for the questions. I found those quite stimulating. I would like to ask Nigel what is meant by judgment in the New Testament, in terms of judgment about how we deal with one another. I can get that, just about. How we deal with the earth, and how does that relate to the promise of a new earth and a new creation?
Well, I think I'm going to give Hilary a chance to say something on that, and you can pick that up with Nigel over a pint in the pub afterwards.
Oh, right. Oh, dear. I think I could do with a pint in the pub before I answer that question. There is an interesting verse in Revelation chapter 11, I think it is, which just says, God's judgment is for those that destroy the earth. And it's one of those throwaway lines that you think, I wish that had been unpacked a little bit more, but actually I've discussed it with a few New Testament scholars, and it seems to be a warning, to my mind, that how we treat the earth, not just how we treat one another, is a matter of God's judgment, whatever that means, and we will all have different views as to what judgment means. But I feel like it's about, at very least, being called to account for our actions or our inactions, and being able to say, I thought about this, I didn't ignore this, I didn't live as if it didn't matter, I thought about the person, subsistence farmer that's struggling, I thought about the species that's going extinct in the other side of the world. So I suspect that the very fact that everybody is here means that, we are all thinking about these things. I feel like there's a lot of people in churches for whom it just doesn't pass them by. And sometimes that's just because in their church it's not talked about. The beauty of the eco-church award scheme is it gets it talked about in churches, and that's really good. So whichever church you're from, talk about it in your church. And I'm convicting myself of that. My husband sat here and he's been nagging at me to talk about it more in my church for a while. So I have to go and do something about it now.
Thank you. I think that probably brings us to the end, sadly. I realize we could probably have a lecture on every one of those answers that you have given to the questions that have been asked.
Thankfully not.
There is just so much to unpack on this, but I want to say thank you very much for coming and speaking with us about this, for drawing our attention to all the work that you are doing. And I think particularly I was struck that you are working on the Apocrypha and drawing that into this, because it's so easy for us to sort of pigeonhole it into a few of our choice verses that always sound really good and snappy, and to remind us about what wisdom says too. That is what I am taking away, and the reminder that it is about justice for everyone and the whole earth. And I certainly find hope in thinking that the way we speak about it has changed from climate change to climate justice, and to speak more broadly about that in terms of justice too. So thank you for that too. And I have a large book for you, in case you ever really bored or can't sleep, The History of Ely Cathedral.
Oh,
so that should keep going for a while when you turn your mind from something other than climate issues. So thank you for being with us this evening.
Thank you very much. Oh, amazing. You can tell from the size of the book that Ely Cathedral has been here for a very long time. Thank you all. You've been a great group of people to speak to.